A long time ago, in a time called the Old West, people rode on horses and lived in small towns. There was crime practically everywhere, and the men responsible for this crime called themselves the cowboys. They wore red sashes around their waists, and they were ruthless and mean to everyone who wasn't on their team. They did what they wanted, took what they wanted, and no one could stop them.
Over 100 exiled Texas outlaws band together to form the ruthless gang recognized by the red sashes they wear. They call themselves the Cowboys.
It wasn't until a man named Wyatt Earp came into town that the Cowboys finally had met their match. Wyatt Earp was a lawman who made a name for himself in a place called Dodge City. He arrested and cleaned up Dodge City and became famous for it. His reputation for being tough and by the book spread across the country, and he became a legend almost. He rode into a new city called Tombstone with his brothers, not to clean up the town and be a lawman, but to strike it rich. He had no interest in being a lawman any longer, and he refused the job a number of times. Instead, just as he rode into town, he went into a restaurant where there were adult games being played. Wyatt saw a man in charge of the place who was dealing cards. He was being loud and mean and bullying everyone around him. Wyatt had enough. He casually walked over to the man and told him to get up and get out of his chair. The man pretended to be tough, but Wyatt stood his ground and glared at the man with his dark eyes and saw right through it. The man threatened to pull out his weapon, and Wyatt still made no move and showed no fear. The man gave up, and Wyatt threw him out of the door and told him never to come back.
Just want to let you know you're sitting in my chair.
Is that a fact?
Yeah, it's a fact.
Well, for a man that don't go heeled, you run your mouth kind of reckless, don't you?
No need to go heel to get the bulge on a tub like you.
Is that a fact?
That's a fact.
I'm real scared.
Right, you're scared. I can see that in your eyes. Go ahead, skin it. Skin that smoke wagon and see what happens.
Listen, mister, I'm getting awful tired of your...
I'm getting tired of your gas. Now jerk that pistol and go to work. I said throw down, boy. You gonna do something or just stand there and bleed? No? I didn't think so. All right, youngster, out you go.
Wyatt and his brothers soon became well known in Tombstone in the adult card games and the saloons. Saloons are fancy for restaurants. They were so well known that the leader of the Cowboys, Curly Bill, wanted to meet Wyatt and tell them that he and the Cowboys were the law, and he'd better watch his step.
Wyatt Earp, huh? Heard of you.
Listen now, Mr. Kansas law dog. Law don't go around here. Savvy?
I'm retired.
Good. That's real good.
Curly and Wyatt stared at each other, and neither of them backed down. One of the Cowboys started challenging Wyatt's friend Doc Holliday. They verbally challenged each other back and forth in different language called Latin.
You must be Doc Holliday.
That's the rumor.
You retired too?
Not me. I'm in my prime.
Yeah, you look it.
You must be Ringo. Look, darling, Johnny Ringo. The deadliest pistolier since Wild Bill, they say.
Then, quick as a flash, the cowboy, Johnny Ringo, pulled out his weapon and started slinging it all over the place, twirling it around and around, over his head, around his back, showing off how good he was. People whistled in excitement as he put the weapon away and waited for Doc to do something. Doc took a sip from his cup and then twirled it around, mocking Johnny. Around and around he spun, all while staring at Johnny, and people laughed and clapped, and the challenge was over. Tensions were high in the town with all the trouble the Cowboys were causing, and it seemed like something was about to happen. One night, an accident in the middle of the street caused Wyatt to arrest Curly Bill. Wyatt wasn't a lawman, but Curly needed to go to jail. Wyatt was all by himself, and the Cowboys surrounded him. The Cowboys demanded that Wyatt release Curly Bill, but he refused. They were going to rush Wyatt and hurt him, but Wyatt stood his ground and looked the Cowboys down with his tough stare. Then Doc came up behind the Cowboys and backed Wyatt up with his two shiny pistols.
He said to turn loose of him.
I'm not. So go home.
Law dog, you don't step aside, we'll tear you apart.
You die first, get it? Your friends might get me in a rush, but not before I make your head into a canoe. You understand me?
He's bluffing. Let's rush him.
No, he ain't bluffing.
Doc and Wyatt had scared them off for the night, but the Cowboys would return, and when they did, they'd be more than anyone could handle. The next day, 6 Cowboys returned and stared angrily at Wyatt and his brothers as they rode into town. Word had gotten around that they were going to take out Wyatt and his brothers. Wyatt and Doc and his brothers had to do something, so they decided to go and confront the Cowboys and take their weapons away. They walked down the street with the sun on their back over to a small place called the OK Corral. The cowboys were there waiting. As Wyatt and his group approached, everyone stopped and quickly reached for their pistols, but they didn't draw them from their holsters. Wyatt said this wasn't what they wanted and begged for them not to draw their weapons. It was so quiet and no one moved a muscle. One of the cowboys had a look of fear in his eyes when he looked at Doc, and Doc winked at him and smiled. That wink set off a cloud of loud bangs as the men fired their weapons at each other over and over and over again. Smoke poured out of their pistols. Wyatt and his group moved in unison, attacking the cowboys. The never-ending loud shots echoed around the town for everyone to hear. After the last loud bang was heard, all of the cowboys were down. Wyatt knew that word of this would spread, and more cowboys would come now, and he expected the worst. More and more cowboys came into Tombstone, and they terrorized the town, breaking things, scaring people, and driving Wyatt and his brothers out of town. At the train station, Wyatt's brothers boarded the train when a group of cowboys followed them and were going to take them out. The cowboys snuck up on the group and were about to fire when they heard a voice behind them. It was Wyatt Earp. He fired and took one cowboy out. He let the other cowboys live and told them to take a message back to Curly Bill and Johnny Ringo. He was coming after all of them, and he would not stop till all of them were done.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it. The cowboys are finished, you understand me? So run, you cur. Tell all the other curs the law's coming. You tell them I'm coming!
Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and his group of 4 U.S. Marshals rode hard from town to town all over the place, searching for anyone wearing a red sash, anyone who was a cowboy. They rode their horses into restaurants, they broke into haircut stores, they chased down people on horseback, and didn't stop until they had every last one of them. Wyatt and his group rode with vengeance and the law on their side. They were doing a good job of it too until one day they ran into an ambush. An ambush is an unexpected trap. Wyatt knelt beside a tree and looked across a creek, and suddenly there were shots and weapons and bursts of smoke coming from all over the place and from the other side of the creek. There must have been 15 men out there firing at Wyatt and his friends. They were in trouble. Curly Bill shouted at Wyatt from across the creek and said that this was his last stand because Wyatt was outnumbered big time. Wyatt took a deep breath. He was scared, and you could see it in his eyes. Something came over him, though, and he rose up amidst the firefight, walked right into the creek towards the men firing at him. Curly Bill couldn't believe that Wyatt was still coming after them amidst these crazy ambush. He was amazed and decided to charge Wyatt in the creek as well. Curly Bill fired at Wyatt over and over again, but he couldn't hit him for some reason. Wyatt drew his weapon and fired, taking Curly Bill out. Doc then charged into the creek and stood side by side bravely, and they took out all 15 of the cowboys without getting hurt. It was amazing, and this battle would surely go down in history. Doc was sick and should have been home in bed, but he stood by his friend Wyatt despite the danger. And he knew that with Curly Bill out of the way, Johnny Ringo would take over as the leader of the cowboys, and he'd come after them and Wyatt in a couple of days. One cowboy rode up to them and told Wyatt that Ringo challenged him to a duel to settle this thing once and for all. He told Wyatt where to meet Ringo the next day.
Ringo wanted to make sure he got your attention, Marshal. He wants a straight-up fight, just you and him. Settle this thing once and for all. Oak Grove at the mouth of Silver Springs Canyon, 7 o'clock.
You tell him I'll be there!
Are you crazy?
I'll be there!
With Doc sick and being outnumbered, Wyatt had no choice but to accept the duel. But he was scared. Ringo was super fast and the best in the West at duels. He could pull out his weapon and fire faster than anyone and faster than you could blink an eye. Wyatt believed that there was no way he could beat Ringo. Doc agreed, but Wyatt had no choice but to go and meet Ringo alone. Johnny Ringo waited by a large oak tree as the sun rose to light up the scene. Ringo noticed a man approaching with the brim of his hat covering his eyes. Ringo was surprised that Wyatt showed up. The man raised his eyes, and it was Doc. He snuck out of bed and took Wyatt's place.
Well, I didn't think you had it in you.
I'm your huckleberry. Why, Johnny Ringo, you look like somebody just walked over your grave.
Fight's not with you, Holiday.
I beg to differ, sir. We started a game we never got to finish. Play for blood, remember?
Ringo instantly had a look of fear, as Doc was also known to be pretty fast and fearless. Doc challenged Ringo, and they slowly circled each other. Round and round, very slowly, each man never took his eyes off the other. Every movement was slow, and the tension built and built, and neither man wanted to make the first move. Ringo's eyes widened as he suddenly drew his weapon, but lightning fast, Doc pulled out his weapon, fired, and Ringo went down. Doc had won, and Wyatt was grateful that Doc had done what he did.
All right, let's finish it.
Indeed, sir. The last charge of Wyatt Earp and his immortals.
The story ends with Wyatt, Doc, and his team riding across the field on horseback, chasing down the remaining cowboys and finishing them off. The cowboys had been destroyed forever, the Wild West was tamed, and Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday became legendary friends and lawmen that people still talk about today. The end.